All right. So yeah, hi everybody. Welcome to our second training of the year as part of our Lower Cape Housing Institute. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, and I'm joined by my colleague, Colinda Deegan, who's our Housing Advocacy Program Manager. In case you don't know too much about us, we are a community development corporation serving the 8 towns of Lower Cape Cod. And today we've partnered with Laura Schufelt, who's the Director of Community Assistance at Massachusetts Housing Partnership. Laura is a Cape Cod resident and has helped many towns develop RFPs on the Cape, and she'll be walking us all through the process of writing a request for proposals related to seeking a developer to build affordable housing in your town. A couple of housekeeping matters. This training is scheduled to run until 12. Laura will be taking questions throughout, but we do ask that you use the Zoom feature to raise your hand or just type your question in the chat, and I'll be monitoring both of those things. So I'll be calling on you to ask your question if you raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question, or I'll read your question from the chat. I do ask, because Laura is going to be sharing her screen, if you just physically raise your hand, I won't be able to see you. So I really do need you to use the Zoom raise your hand feature or type your question in the chat, and that way I can make sure that I get to all of your questions. We'll also have more time for questions at the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, we're recording the training, so we're going to send out a link to the training recording after the training, not today, but soon next week. And we'll also be including those slides with that email. So any questions before we get started? Or does anyone want to practice raising your hand? We're all good? All right. So with that, I will turn it over to Laura Schufelt.
Thanks, Andrea, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to be here. I am going to be sharing my screen, but before I do that, I just want to have folks go around and just introduce yourself and say where you're from. And if you could, I'll call on someone, and then after you say where you're from, if you could call on someone else on the screen, so we can go around the board. Michelle, you're in my top left square, so I'm gonna ask you to introduce yourself.
Well, good morning, Laura and everyone. My name is Michelle Jarosevich. I'm the housing specialist in the town of Provincetown. Worked with Laura for decades on many projects. And I guess I'll call on Alan, who's next to me.
Good morning, Alan McLennan, Chairman of the Affordable Housing Trust in Orleans. And I will call on Jill.
Jill Scalisi, Housing Coordinator Brewster, and I will call on Lynn.
Hi, I'm Lynn Pleffner and Chatham Housing Community Partnership. I'll call on Harry.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Harry Turkanian. I'm the brand new chair of Wellfleet's brand new Affordable Housing Trust. And I'll call on Paul, and I've got to let my cat out. Come on, buddy.
Hello, Laura. Hello, everyone. Paul Richinskas from Brewster. I'm on the Community Preservation Committee and Affordable Housing Trust. And let's see, where are we, Harry, Larry, Amanda.
I'm Amanda Bebrin, and I'm on the Brewster Planning Board, and I will call on our other Paul.
Good morning, everyone. Paul Legg. I'm the Director of Community Development in the town of Eastham, and I'm the staff liaison to the Affordable Housing Trust. And I will call on Allie. Hi, Allie.
Paul. My name is Allie Sabatino. I'm the Principal Planner for the town of Chatham. I will call on, say, Florence.
I'm Florence Selden, long interest in affordable housing on the CDP Advisory Council, and currently a member of the Finance Committee in Chatham. And I will call on Andrea.
Is there another Andrea? Because I'm still the Director of Housing Advocacy at the CDP.
Did I call on, didn't join right at the beginning. Okay, I'll call on somebody else. I'm calling on Elizabeth Harder.
Hello, Florence. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Harder. I am on the Barnstable County Assembly of Delegates for Harwich, and I am also on the Harwich Housing Authority and the CPC. And I call on, oh, I thought I saw, but she's not here. I'll call on Lauren Barker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Barker. I work for the town of Eastham as the Economic Development Planner. And I'm sorry that I was a few minutes late. I had a child-related emergency to attend to, so my apologies. Nice to see everyone.
I'll keep going. George, you want to introduce yourself?
George Meservey. I'm the town planner in Orleans. Fran McLennan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Fran McLennan. I'm on the Affordable Housing Committee in Orleans and on the board of CDP. And I will call on Gary.
Hi, I'm Gary Sorkin from Wellfleet. I'm on a number of the housing committees in town and also our 95 Lawrence Road Task Force, where we're planning a large development. Oh, I have to call. Is there anyone left?
Lorraine.
Lorraine?
Good morning. I'm Elaine McElroy. I'm chair of the Wellfleet Housing Authority and also a member of Wellfleet's new Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. And I will call on Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Strauss from Eastham. I'm the chair of the Tea Time Committee.
Okay. Let's see. Carla?
I'm Carla Ferroni. I'm the housing coordinator in Falmouth, and I administer the Falmouth Affordable Housing Fund. And I'm going to call on Donna.
Hi, I'm Donna Kalanick. I'm the assistant town administrator in the town of Brewster. I'm on the Brewster Affordable Housing Trust. I work really closely with Jill Scalise in running the Brewster Housing Program. And in my spare time, I'm on the Harwich Community Preservation Committee.
Okay, I think there's just.
I'm gonna call on, I don't know who has an Ally. Did you go yet?
Yeah, I think it's just Wendy.
I think Katie too.
Okay, I'll call on Katie then.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Donovan. I'm the Director of Community Development for the town of Chatham.
Okay, Wendy Olson.
Hi, I'm Wendy Olson. I'm the Director of the Yarmouth Housing Authority.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Laura.
Shelley, are you there? I think Shelley's just listening. Oh,
I am. I'm just going to be listening. I'm with MHP.
And Ruby's here too.
Yeah.
And, Pelinda, did you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Pelinda Deegan, Housing Advocacy Program Manager at CDP.
I'll introduce myself.
Oh, Robert.
Robert Tobias, Brewster Finance Committee and liaison to the Brewster Affordable Housing Trust.
Okay, and I think that just leaves Jay if you're on.
I am. This is Jay Coburn. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Community Development Partnership.
Great. All right, I think did we get everyone? I think so. Terrific. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that we can go through this presentation. Okay, so we're here to talk about the disposition of public land and what you need to know as a community member or someone who is advocating for using public land for affordable housing. As I said before, my name is Laura Schufelt. I'm the Director of Community Assistance at Mass Housing Partnership, MHP. I am a native of Cape Cod and resident of Cape Cod. I've been doing affordable housing for decades. I'll leave it at that. One of my main responsibilities is working with communities to move land that's been designated for affordable housing through to a request for proposals to bring a developer on, and then assisting and facilitating the award, the scoring and the award of the proposal to get a developer on board. So who are we? MHP is a quasi-state agency that works with communities to create innovative policy and financing solutions that provide affordable homes and better lives for the people of Massachusetts. We do that in 4 different ways. We have the Center for Housing Data that does research on housing data to support our policy efforts. The Community Assistance Team, which I am the director of, works with communities in direct technical assistance. We do trainings like this and like our annual Housing Institute for public officials and advocates and those who want to know more about affordable housing and from A to Z. We also work on state policy and we put together publications. Our main business at MHP is permanent financing of affordable rental housing. And then we also have the One Mortgage program, which is the most affordable first-time homebuyer program that's out there. So the goals for this session. I want you to understand the reasons why you would dispose of public land versus public development. Get basic information on the requirements of a request for proposals. There's been some recent decisions by the Attorney General's office that have increased the cautions on both the request for proposal, the land disposition agreement, or sometimes called the land development agreement, and lease provisions if, in fact, the public entity is going to be leasing the land versus selling the land. And then lastly, this is a process that's best done with help. If you're not an expert at it or haven't done it before, it's best to reach out and get some help, either through private consultants or through MHP. So why would you dispose of public property versus developing it yourself? First of all, for a public entity to develop, it increased the costs overall upwards of 30% to go through the public construction, Chapter 149 and Chapter 7 and prevailing wages. So you add cost and there's limited subsidies, so it's more difficult to get a financially feasible project if the public entity is doing it. There's financial risk that a town or a housing authority may not want to enter into. It's complex. Affordable housing is not always linear, and if you haven't done it before, it's difficult to get in the door. There's political implications. If you are in the middle of a project and sitting on the Board of Selectmen and you're up for election and people don't like that you're doing affordable housing, you could lose your seat, and then the project may have to be redesigned if there are too much opposition. And lastly, public entities, towns, trusts are not really in the business of managing private housing. So who can help? MHP can help. We can assess site feasibility and other pre-development activities for potential housing sites. And then we can assist in drafting RFPs and assisting with developer selection for publicly owned land. Before I get to Chapter 30B, the procurement law, which is what dictates how an RFP is put together and why an RFP is put together, I want to just identify who we're talking about as public entities. So it's any municipality and all their subsidiaries. So a municipal housing trust is included. Local housing authorities are their own independent public entity. So we're talking about anyone in the public realm has to use a request for proposal to dispose of real estate that is valued over $35,000. And like I said, Mass General Law, Chapter 30B is the procurement law. It is both for procuring or acquiring supplies, services, and real property, and also for the disposition of real property. The Inspector General has this lovely 30B manual that is written really in layman's terms, and it gives you the basic outlines of what you need to do. It does not go into the nuances that I will be getting into that are based on case law and decisions and just overall practice over the years for requests for proposals. I listed here the requirements, the minimum requirements for advertising. I'm not going to go over each of them. The last one I will tell you, the last one on the list is important. All deliberations and scoring of proposals must be supposed to be done, not one, must be done in open meetings. The drafting, if it's a public entity, is subject to open meeting laws. So it's all done in open sessions, including deliberations and scoring. So before you start creating a request for proposals, and sometimes before you even start identifying land or buildings, hopefully before you start identifying lands or buildings, the community should identify the needs in the community with a needs assessment, or at least a gathering of available data that will help inform the needs of the community, so that you are responding to those and not just anecdotal, I know somebody who needs X. Create or update a housing production plan or an action plan. If you're a trust, you might have an action plan that's based off of a housing production plan. When you have that, you have a roadmap for development, but also for reaching the goals of the community. And the housing production plan is should be done in a public process with community input and community engagement. So it helps inform what you're going to produce and what kind of properties you'll be looking for production. And next, and sometimes it's part of the housing production and action plan process, you can identify land or surplus buildings for disposition. And once you do that, it's important to build community support for the disposition and development of the property. So before you take the next step, let the community know what you're looking to do, that you want to develop it for affordable housing. You won't have any feasibility at this point, but you're getting the input so that the next step, which is the first required step in putting a request for proposal together, is having the property declared available for disposition, or in the Inspector General's terminology is surplus. That usually requires town meeting or town council vote if it's municipally owned. And if it's owned by the local housing authority, it most likely will need approval by the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that's why it's important to start the conversation before you get to town meeting, so that folks know what's going on. You get to town meeting and hopefully you get a yes vote to declare it surplus and ready for development. Okay. The next step is looking at site and financial feasibility. Once you've identified the site, you've got it declared surplus, then you gather all the title and property information from town records first, see what's available, if there's any studies of the land, if there's, hopefully you have a survey, if there's any environmental reports, and then what you don't have, what is missing from the records, if you don't have a survey, then you need to engage folks to get a survey to look at the title, to make sure that there's no restrictions in the title that you might not have been aware of. If it had been donated to the town and it has a specific use in that deed, you need to know that. If there's easements on the property, if there's wetlands, a wetlands delineation is important because that will show you any constraints. So there's a whole range of site feasibility that needs to be done or is best to be done, because developers are attracted to requests for proposals where they know that in the end they're going to be able to develop. If you don't give enough information in the request for proposals, or you haven't done all the due diligence before, then there's question marks on the developer's part as to whether there are constraints on the site that haven't been identified and included in the request for proposals.
Laura?
Yes.
Question. Are there any other ways that a town can signal their willingness to partner with a developer aside from language in the RFP?
I guess I'm not understanding the question.
Yeah, so I hear a lot about this idea that it's important for towns to, let's see, what's the wording that I'm looking for, to make it clear that there's consensus around housing needs, that there is consensus around the use of the site. And so developers obviously want to work within an environment where there is higher predictability and where they know that there's like a welcoming environment for affordable housing development. So I'm curious if there are other ways that a town can signal that agreement.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of towns will engage in a series of community engagement sessions with the community. There's lots of different ways to do it. A lot of times it includes, of course, in pandemic, not in person, informational sessions, but sessions where Zoom meetings where folks can express their concerns or their support or their preferences. The community engagement piece of it can also include surveys that are online that folks can answer questions about, need or any, kind of restrictions that they'd want to put on the property. I would just caution that you understand as we go through, and I towards the end, I'll list some cautions about what can and can't go in a request for proposals, that you don't make promises that you can't keep in a RFP. You can't say it's going to look like that building over there, or it can only be, this type of housing, in a very narrow focus. But definitely including in the RFP an attachment with either a summary of community engagement or some materials from the community engagement is helpful. And I will say also that usually, so if it's a municipality, if they've either given the land to the trust to develop, it's declared surplus, and then the Board of Selectmen says, well, this would best be moved forward by giving it to the trust. That gives developers confidence that the Board of Selectmen's on board, that the town meeting has voted it. It doesn't replace community engagement, but it shows a nexus from identifying the land to putting it out where there's been support. So there are basic elements of the request for proposals. The first page, it's usually one page because it's usually what goes into the legal ad, is the invitation to bid. And an invitation to bid is just that. It's the town of blank is seeking a developer to purchase, maybe lease this land in order to create affordable housing. The developer will be responsible for designing, building, and managing, if it's rental, or selling the properties. And it lists in the invitation to bid when the deadline is, if there's any site visits or informational meetings, if there's how much time there is to ask questions. It's pretty pro forma. It's, it'll have some changes as to, where the land is, how much information there is on the land in the invitation to bid. But it's a one pager because it's what you want to then use as the legal ad or basis for the legal ad. Another section is the property description. Oftentimes that includes all the site feasibility information in summary form with an attachment with whatever reports you've got come in the back. Sometimes there's background. Some folks get verbose in their background, given the history of the town from when it was constituted all the way up to the present. And sometimes it's just a brief background on where the community is now. There's always a section on use restrictions. Use restrictions also has to be part of making the land surplus. I think it said it in the slide. I don't think I said it out loud, that it's made surplus and includes any restrictions. So the use restrictions, how much affordability is going to be required, how much, and then how much is going to be desired. So there may be two things. You want at least so much, but you'd really like to have greater affordability or a greater range. And it's best to put that in writing, and then it will also be in your scoring.
Laura, who usually writes it, the RFP, it develops and writes the RFP in a town?
So usually Many times they'll ask my help. I've done most of them on the Cape not all of them. Sometimes it's the planner, sometimes it's the chief procurement officer, or it's a combination. The ones that I've worked on have mostly been committees, either task force that have been formed by the Board of Selectmen or whoever has control of the land, a housing authority, Board of Commissioners if it's housing authority land. And then sometimes it's just the planner and the chair of the housing committee and a member of the Board of Selectmen. It's all over the board, but the actual drafting is usually done, either by the planner, chief procurement officer, or me, or a consultant, if it's not me. So once you have your narrative done, the invitation to build, the property description, the use restrictions, you'll have submission requirements and evaluation criteria. So there'll be threshold criteria. You have to have done X, Y, and Z, or you don't keep going to have the rest of it scored. And then the evaluation criteria, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's how the proposals are scored. So your submission requirements have to be, have to give you enough information so that you then can score the criteria. So if you're looking for a developer that is experienced in doing a project similar to the project that you're looking for, then your submission requires they're going to ask them to show you what experience that they had and list the projects that are similar. That's important if you have evaluation criteria, but that you haven't asked for the correct information, it'll be hard to score. And lastly, any contract terms and conditions. That can mean either a template, purchase and sale, or land disposition agreement, or template lease, so that the developer knows what terms and conditions are going to be required moving forward. All good. So I have started advising groups to look at a series of questions and try and get to, if not consensus, at least some idea of where they want to go before they start writing the request for proposals, or it gets revised and revised and revised as they keep going. And these should be based on information that you have from needs assessment, from any plans that you have, whether it's the local comprehensive plan, the regional policy plan, your housing production plan if you have it, and then also what your due diligence feasibility has told you. The feasibility may tell you that you can do 120 bedrooms on the site, but in order to do that, you need a wastewater treatment plant, and that will throw the financial feasibility out of whack. So taking all the information that you've gathered so far and all the information that you have from planning that you've done, it's best to have conversations around, okay, what's the housing tenure? Is it going to be ownership or rental? What's our greatest need? What's financially feasible? And what does all our planning point to? Is it going to be age friendly or age restricted? Remembering that age restricted typically requires services. And like I said, it should be influenced by your documented need, not anecdotal need. Any of these that have an asterisk mean that this will affect what you decide on this, or what consensus around this may affect the financial feasibility. So they should be tested against financial feasibility. Affordability, how many homes must be income restricted? At what levels? Will it be a range? Will you have, like I said before, a minimum and then a desired? Building design. Building design is tricky. You cannot be prescriptive. You cannot say it must look like X. You can give parameters on what you want to see. You can do guidelines or standards. But if you get too prescriptive, then it becomes, it tips the balance to a public construction project. And all those Massachusetts public construction laws, Chapter 149, Chapter 7, which is designer selection, and prevailing wage will come into effect and most likely make your project infeasible financially. So how detailed do you want to be? Broad statements, design guidelines, refer to publications that are already out there. The Cape Cod Commission has one. Amenities. Do you want to require or prefer, suggest amenities? And what might those be? It might be that there be a rental office that's on site, that there be a community room or a community building. Remembering that these add money. That do you want to require that there be some dedicated outdoor space for either child play or just resident gathering? Sorry if you hear my phone, I can't turn it off in the background. So those are considerations for amenities. Interior or unit design. Do you have preferences for what or requirements for the interior? Are there minimum or maximum square footages? Do you want to have individual exterior dedicated space, so balconies or patios? Again, these can add cost. Do you want to have in-unit laundries? All of those kind of things. These are all great things to talk about before you start writing a request for proposal, so that you can get all of these things in the first draft. There's more. Site design. Do you care where the development should be sited? If you have a large site and you'd rather make sure that there's some open space or undisturbed space, this is where you put it. Do you access? Is there a best access place that you've determined in your due diligence, and you can say, you know, we want 2 points of access and egress, or we really want it, you know, off of, you know, on the border of the lot, whatever you're looking at. In site design comes wastewater or stormwater requirements. Are you going to make requirements that are above Massachusetts laws? Most Massachusetts towns have stricter requirements than Title V or than the stormwater requirements of the laws. And I think this would also include wetlands. And again, if you are adding constraints, you're adding costs. Energy efficiency. Do you have a preference for a requirement of green design elements? They add money, but a lot of times they also add affordability in energy consumption going forward. There are, you know, if you're going to use solar, there's solar credits, and then obviously you have the reduction in utility costs. So if you're going to require it or you're going to preference it, which ones, how strict? Do they just have to meet the guidelines of a certain certain program, or do they have to actually get the certification? I think I want to stop there to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, so there's a conversation happening in the chat about tenure, whether a site has to be all ownership or all rental or both. And Paul Ratintos has offered that it could be both. However, you'd likely have to subdivide the land, as it would be pretty impossible to find a developer experience in both. And more importantly, the state funding streams are very different for ownership and rental. It would also mean separate RFPs. Is there anything else that you want to add to that, Laura?
I agree with that. There actually are a couple of new projects that just were awarded funds yesterday that have a combination, but they did it, I understand, because I looked into it, they did it as the whole thing as a condominium. And so the home ownership are condominiums and the rental is, another condominium. It certainly complicates financing in subsidies for affordable housing. The state does not have subsidies for home ownership, or there's limited. So if you're doing home ownership, the subsidy, really comes locally, has to come locally. So to separate the two, you couldn't use rental financing money to subsidize the condos or the home ownership portions. So the cleanest way is to subdivide and do fee simple on either, on both, and finance separately. But there is a way around it it seems like it's being done mostly in cities, but okay, so I'll keep going. Developer experience. How many years in residential development? Does it have to be affordable housing? Do they need to have had successful similar projects? And do they have to actually be the developer, or can they have been working for a developer and now off on their own? Can they use that experience that they've had in the past? We've had a couple of new developers come on, and obviously, if they have to have the direct developer experience, they'll never get started if everyone requires that. But if they have had substantial experience with another developer, and they may have to partner the first couple times. But again, you look for developer experience and look at what they've done in the past. And if it's just commercial, storage units, how are you going to score their experience? And is that threshold? Management, oftentimes the developer will hire third-party management. The developer will have, be the developer, hire a construction company and hire a management company. Sometimes they hire another subsidiary of themselves to do the management. But that being said, whoever they've identified as the management company, do they or a team member have to have affordable housing management experience, and how much? Affordable housing compliance is different than what you would do in you don't do compliance in market housing. They may do a check to make sure that you can reasonably afford the rent or a credit check, but they don't have to actually meet income determination and income limitations. So it's different in my opinion, someone there should have affordable housing management experience and also fair housing experience. And make sure that the management company doesn't have any fair housing complaints against them. Okay. Financial feasibility. Who will review the financial? Is there anyone within the town or whoever's overseeing this that has the expertise to do it? Will you hire a consultant? And then if there's a gap in the financial feasibility, would the town entertain or encourage an application for local funds? Sometimes that's part of the RFP, sometimes it's not, it's just left up to the developer. If there's a big ticket item, like a wastewater treatment plant, oftentimes that will be in the request for proposals that there may be local funds to help assist in that, or that the town would be applying for state funds that could assist with that. Or they may have received them already. So financial feasibility is one to think about, and to think about who's going to review those. If you're conveying the land by deed, so selling the land, then are you doing it below market rent? If you're doing it below market rent, there's certain requirements of notification with the central register. If it's a long-term lease, there are cautions that I will get to around control and around what provisions can be in the lease and what are problematic based on decisions that the Attorney General's recently made. Review committee and awarding authority. Who's going to review the proposal? The same people that put it together or somebody else? You need to be explicit about that, or at least know who that's going to be before you release the RFP. Will the awarding authority decide on a specific number of finalists or just the top choice? So once the review committee, say it's a task force like in Wellfleet, they bring their recommendation to the Board of Selectmen, who is the awarding authority. Are they going to bring only their top choice, or will they bring a couple of finalists? That's a choice that they should be made. And again, always testing for financial feasibility as you go through this. So it's important to have someone who understands affordable housing finance on the drafting committee. How are we doing on time? Okay. I feel like I'm talking a lot. So if
there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
Do you recommend land conveyance or a long-term lease?
The cleanest is conveyance. Long-term leases are one factor that can trigger a bid protest.
And Jay raised his hand. Jay, do you want to unmute yourself?
Loris, say a bit more about that, because I think in the past, the conventional wisdom has been that a 99-year ground lease was the ideal way to move forward. It allowed the town to have some sense of control, and it also might have been an easier sell at town meeting, in that you weren't giving the valuable land away to some evil developer, and there were still strings attached. Why a different recommendation now?
So in the last year and a half or so, well, I'll go backwards. Historically, folks like me have relied on an attorney general decision back in the late 80s that said that a 99-year lease equaled a conveyance in the eyes of Chapter 149, which the Attorney General has authority over, which is the public construction laws. And there was that opinion. It's a letter opinion in response to specific questions. And then the then General Counsel of DHCD, the Department of Community and Housing Development in Massachusetts, also reiterated what constituted a conveyance with a lease. Fast forward to about a year and a half ago, there was a bid protest in Holyoke that the Attorney General ruled in favor of the subcontractors who were suing, saying that it should have been a public construction bid. And some of the factors, the decision was lengthy, and it relied on an analysis of a SJC decision from 2010 that, in my opinion, doesn't apply. But in any way, it's not my opinion. It's not me to say. And the lengthy decision listed a number of factors that they felt contributed to either in that project, but also in future projects, if a certain preponderance of factors were found, then they didn't really weight them. So it's not clear, but a lease is one of the top leading factors of pushing it towards public construction, and specifically a lease where there is control. So I've been reviewing leases more because we had a template, and I guess we always just thought people were following it. But if they put in that, they have to, that the town or the landlord has to have pre-approval of the design, that's a problem. And it's in several. It's in the land disposition agreement, and then it transfers into the lease. It says that the tenant, the developer, has to supply to the town all tenant information that they gather for compliance. To me, that's a privacy issue, but that's also, control over who's living there. Have to be named additional insurers on all insurance. I could go on. There's lots of different factors, and I'll be coming to what some of those are in the end, but that's what's changed. That's what's changed the landscape. And we have not been able to get clarity from the Attorney General's office. So Mass Housing Partnership is in the process of, we were kind of at the end of a process of doing a publication on a guide for writing a request for proposals with a template embedded in it. And I'm now editing that to put in the cautions that I'll talk about up front, what factors you have to be careful with, and then we're going to take it and hopefully get some consensus around the state agencies, and then take it to the Attorney General and say, this is what we think. Are we there?
Jay, you had a follow-up question on conveyance?
Yeah, Laura, so can you convey the land for, one of the other reasons why ground leases have been a good idea too is the cost of land in our region is a significant burden on the financing of a project. And so by basically making the land, that's the town putting in a major chunk of money. If you convey the land, can the land be conveyed for $1? Or does it have to be sold at some fair market value?
It can be conveyed for $1. You just have to report that if you convey it, and even if you lease it for less than market value lease, you have to report in central register that you've done it and why you've done it. The public purpose of affordable housing is the reason.
Okay.
So you can do it. Sometimes it's difficult to do it if it's a just a segment of a larger parcel that has other uses. It's difficult to carve that out sometimes and to make without making a lot of non-conformities, but also it's just difficult if they have shared entrances or things like that. So there are cases where you almost have to lease, and then you really have to be careful. But conveyances, there's still other cautions even with conveyances. All right, I know that was kind of getting into the weeds, but it's a front of mind for me because it's a lot of the work that I do. Okay, so once you've gone through those questions that we talked about before, then you start drafting the RFP. And as you're drafting the RFP, I talked about what submission requirements you would need, and then so that you can evaluate having documentation in front of you to be as objective as possible. And then some folks weigh the elements of the criteria, the evaluation, so that they have some things are weighed more than others in the scoring. It can get extremely complicated when you do that. But if it's a level playing field, does affordability equal developer experience equal energy efficiency? That's what you have to, or will you assign different values to each of those? Okay. Let's see, I can't see this. This is a example of the development concept, what the narrative might say in asking for the developer to submit. This would be the submission for the development concept, that they have to include a detailed description of the concept. So they have to be, have some narrative around what they're thinking, and then all these other elements that they would have to give you for project financing, the 10-year operating budget, letters of interest. I will tell you that when we get to, we'll talk about developer experience and their financial capacity, that the Attorney General has also ruled that all elements of the submission are public records. So developers will not give you their personal financial information, or typically they won't give you their business financial information either. So if you require that, they won't put a proposal in. So how we kind of do an end around that is to ask for lender references and bank references, so that we can, whoever's reviewing can actually call the references and say, this developer is projecting that they're going to have a $1.5 million equity investment in this. Does that seem reasonable to you that they can do this? Otherwise, you'll get you might get some nonprofits, but even nonprofits don't want to give you their audited statements. You can certainly look up their 990s, which is a, kind of summary of what they do, but you won't get the individual's financials, and you won't get the business financials. So that's the end around. And I'm not sure that that's in this part, but anyway, that's what a development concept submission requirement would look like. This is a way to do the comparative evaluation criteria. This happened to be developer experience and capacity for a project that I did with the Bourne Housing Authority. And I do it this way because I like outlines and I like I like charts. I find it easier. So on the left, you list what you're looking for in developer experience or whatever the topic is, and then what would be unacceptable based on that criteria, what would be advantageous, and what would be highly advantageous. And obviously, you can either just score based on those categories, or you could actually assign points to it. So in this project, it was I think roughly 50 units, 45 or 50 units of family housing in Bourne. They wanted to see comparable projects, experience with septic systems. Some developers only have worked in sewered communities. So you want to make sure that they understand septic systems, or they have somebody on their team that is. It doesn't have to be the developer. Energy efficiency, property management, they had to have property management team, quality of their reputation references, marketing, property management, and long-term management approach. And then the criteria was set out, and they got, highly advantageous the more experienced they were, and the more comparable the projects were to what we were asking for. And each of the elements criteria that you want to be scoring on, there's a chart like this for it, and it's all in. Typically I do it as an attachment. Sometimes I put it in the body of the RFP. Okay, make sense?
We have a couple questions, if now is a good time.
Okay, it's good time.
Okay, one is, if you can't see financial statements, how do you know the developer is legit, and will the state review them before awarding subsidies?
So yes, the state, when they apply for subsidies, they do have to have personal and business financials in there. You can make sure they're legit, like I said, by calling their bank and lending references. If someone's lent to them before, or they're in the middle of a project, then they'll give you the name of a lending reference that you can call and get that. You get letters of interest for both construction loans and permanent financing, and you can call them and say, did you just write this because you knew the guy, or do you have a history with them? So you can say, like I said, they're looking at personal equity or business equity into this project of $1 million. Do they have working capital that would make that reasonable? As long as you're talking, you can't ask how much do they have in your bank, but you can ask those kind of questions.
And the next question is, should the drafting of the RFP narrative and scorecard happen at the same time? And should the scorecard remain unchanged after the RFP has been sent out?
So yes, that it has to stay the same. Once it's been sent out, it doesn't change. You can kind of do it at the same time. Sometimes you can do the criteria without listing what's unacceptable, advantageous, or highly advantageous. You can list out the criteria, and then that will inform what submissions you need to put into the narrative. So, you know, it's kind of chicken and the egg.
That's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay, I think how are we doing for time? Oh, lots of time. I think we're getting into the cautions. This is the things that you have to be careful for in writing the RFP. And again, that then will be translated into a land disposition or land development agreement. And that's the piece that's between awarding a developer of the project and conveying the land either through a sale or a lease. The land disposition, sometimes called land development agreement, is that bridge between the two that says, this is what you're going to do until we get to a final lease. So you're going to get all your financing together. You're going to get all your permitting done. Permitting first, obviously, and then financing. You're going to get final plans. You're going to get a building permit. And when you get to those, when you close on your construction loan is when the land is actually conveyed. But between awarding and getting a building permit are a lot of activities. And so that agreement spells out kind of what has to happen and when, and if there's timelines on it, or who's going to do what, whose responsibility are certain things. And it also grants the developer access over the land because they don't own it. So it's kind of gives them permission to go on the land and gives them some rights. Okay, so cautions. So these are some of the cautions, and some of it is could be in agreements, and some of them, could be in the lease. Some of them could be in the RFP. The first is any kind of a reversion or first right of refusal. So if the lease says, which one of them I read recently said, if your occupancy ever falls below 65%, that will be a default, and the town or housing authority has the first right of refusal to assume your mortgages. That wouldn't be in a conveyance. If that would be, in a lease, but in a conveyance, once you sell it, it's done. You're done, and so that would be a factor that the Attorney General would say might tip the balance. If there's construction oversight beyond what is typically done, so some recent LDAs, land disposition agreements, say that a representative of the trust, let's say, has to be at every monthly construction meeting, and has to sign off on the requisition. Town wouldn't normally be involved in doing that. The trust wouldn't be involved in doing that, and the housing authority wouldn't be involved in doing that unless they were the developer. Public-private partnership or interdependence. So if there's a public-private partnership, then is subject to public construction laws. If there's interdependence, if the town has to do certain work before, in order to make the project work, it can be a factor. It may not be the only factor, but that's cautionary. If the public entity assumes ownership of the buildings after the lease term or earlier, I saw a recent lease where the public entity was going to assume ownership after the 15-year tax credit term was up. That's 15 years, even though the lease was for 99 years, what actually happened was it really was only for 15 years. If you got into the details of the lease. At the end of the lease term, typically it says that the tenant or the developer can remove the buildings, or the landlord would assume those buildings. Of course, there's language in the lease that says they have to be maintained, so they're getting at the end of the lease term presumably a valuable asset. So that's questionable under the Attorney General's factors. If the housing authority is the landlord and they also are the administrator, it should be administrator of project-based vouchers in the development. I don't know why that is, but that's one of the factors that's listed. The lease term has to be the useful life of the buildings plus 10 years. Usually that is, if it's new construction, useful life is usually defined as 40 years, so that has to be 50 years or more. Usually for funding, they'll look at 75 to 99 as required. If a public entity controls or oversees the construction, we talked about that, or the management, talked a little bit about that when the town wanted to see, monthly rent rolls and documentation, all the documentation on compliance, not acceptable. If a specific design is mandated, or if the design is changed by the town or the housing authority or the public entity after the award. So they can award it to somebody, and then when they're negotiating after the award saying, we really would prefer if instead of, a 3-story building, you do 2 2-story buildings. It happens. That's a no-no. Post-award approvals required by the LDA or the lease, or P&S if that happens to be what they have. And that would be, like I said, if they have to approve, if the town or whoever the public entity has to approve the plans before they go to permitting, if they have to make any other approvals that they wouldn't normally do, if it's over and above what the building commissioner would typically do, for example. That's, again, too much control. All right, so that's the end of my cautions. There's probably, I know there's more, but that gives you a basic idea of the thinking around control and approvals and how it might jeopardize a project that you're working on.
Before you move on, can Allie ask her question, which I'm guessing is about cautions?
Sure.
Hey, Laura, thank you. Can you go back to, can you go back to your first caution slide?
Yeah.
So the one about the public-private partnership or interdependence, Would that be, so as an example, if you were bringing, if the town was bringing sewer to the parcel and say it didn't do that before it, before we got into like an LDA or something like that with the developer, is that considered the public-private partnership interdependence or no?
In a literal reading of the decision, it probably would be. In practice, it hasn't been. So, so for instance, a lot of these projects, the town gets Mass Works and they, fix the road, or they do some road work that has to happen for the project to work, or they bring water, or they bring sewer. That hasn't triggered it. So I think if there were other triggers, it may be listed as a factor, but it wouldn't be the sole factor.
Okay, thanks.
Oops. I think we're going to finish early. So best practices. State your goals clearly. Provide enough information to elicit thoughtful proposals. I can't say that enough. I've said it 100 times already. I'm sorry. Have the right submission requirements to provide a basis for evaluation, and design the evaluation criteria to match the best proposal to your goals. Okay, I can give a couple of examples where that wasn't done, where a community were so weighted developer experience heavily, so that the more experienced they were, really the most experience was going to get the proposal, and didn't realize that by doing that, it discounted what the design was. So the highest score was the least liked design. And so they, rather than matching their goals, they wanted to have a great design with an experienced developer, but they didn't want, they didn't intend to get the result that they got, because they did so heavily weigh developer experience that it discounted pretty much everything else. If the developer was the most experienced, they were going to get the project. So they had to kind of go back and do some refiguring, which is never good after the process. There's always in the request for proposal, usually numerous times, a statement that says all of the proposals can be rejected if it's determined it's in the best interest of the town. So you can start over again. You might get fewer proposals the next time you do it, but you don't have to take any, one of what's been proposed. You can always say, okay, we did something, this wasn't what we were looking for. We need to go back and review our submission requirements and our goals and our evaluation so that we can tweak this, so that we can get the proposal that we want to see. We've got lots of time. Is there any, I did not go into the individual drafting because it changes with every project. Like I said, we will be coming out with a publication that will have a guide and some template language that folks can look at. But I would also suggest that you get help where you can, whether it's through someone who's been through the process before, or MHP, or with a consultant. And at the very least, I also review RFPs for folks who are drafting them locally, and then they send them to me for edits I send back. So there's that option also. Thought I saw a hand up.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat and a hand raised, but I just want to
Great.
reiterate at the top of the chat, Jay mentioned to everyone that there's really no reason why you wouldn't take advantage of the support from MHP. So the CDP would encourage all towns to look for MHP for support in writing an RFP. Okay, couple questions. Would a requirement that a multifamily development have an amenity of a public transit bus stop and turnaround be too prescriptive and risk public construction laws?
No. No, as long as it's, within their, if you're not asking to do something on a public road that would require, and that wouldn't push public construction laws, it just could get expensive. Like if you ask, if you say that you have to put in traffic lights, that's a whole approval process that you can't guarantee. So as long as it's doable on the site and not trying to do it in a public space.
Okay, let me just address the chat before I get to the hands. How do you effectively test a given amenity for financial viability impact on the project?
Well, it depends what it is. If it's, if it's individual laundries, there's a cost. You just add the cost. If it's a community room, again, it's a cost that doesn't produce any revenue. All of those things are in addition to whatever is basically needed everywhere. If you're looking for a community building, understand that does cost a lot more than if you put it within a building. So it's really just adding the cost to the feasibility and are you going to be able to have enough subsidy to cover it?
Okay. Elizabeth, you raised your hand.
Thank you. My question is, you were talking about how one project ended up picking the selection would have required picking the developer they liked the least. And I'm confused about why that would happen. Do developers get to see your scoring and the way you value things?
Yes.
Or, okay, so if, because in the RFP you have to requirements, but they get to see how weighted something is?
Yes.
Oh.
Yep.
Okay.
It has to be open.
Okay. So that's why you'd have to redo it instead of just so you don't have any flexibility once you've set the criteria to say, I know we said that we really want experience, but the most experienced developers project is not what we want. You don't have that flexibility.
You could have the flexibility depending, in this case, they said the highest scorer would be they were specific saying that whoever scored highest would get the award or would be recommended for the award. If they had said that, there's oftentimes I put a sentences that says the successful respondent may not be the highest, may not receive the highest score, but is the most, favorable,
right,
on a consensus or something like that. I forget what the language is, but I usually put that in because otherwise you're not giving your awarding authority any choices.
Okay, thanks.
That's who it has to be. So I like to leave some flexibility in there so you can look at the top two or the top three and make a decision.
Alan McLennan, you raised your hand.
Yes, I want to commend Laura for her 9 cautions on leasing property, but I want to give everybody some homework. When you have some time, sit down and read the SJC case, which is Brassi, B-R-A-S-S-I, as I remember, and then read the Holyoke Housing Authority case. When you read Brassi, you say, how in the hell did they come to what decision they made? I mean, it is unbelievable. And I spent a lifetime reading SJC cases on zoning, and I never know quite what they're saying. But anyways, then read the Holyoke case by the Attorney General's office. It takes Brassi item by item and relates it to the Holyoke case. And when you do that, develop a checklist, and you can see the pitfalls that you've got to avoid. Laura did a great, one sentence summary of each of them. But believe me, sit down for a day to understand this. I've come to the conclusion that if you're really careful, you can do a lease. But have the checkoff list from Holyoke in front of you and see which ones of those issues that they bring from Brassi impact your ground lease. It's one of the most masterful pieces of evaluation I've ever seen, and it's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I would also add that in addition to Holyoke, there's a Springfield decision that actually went against the subcontractors, but is a little bit more clarifying around public funding and some other things. So if you're gonna look at it, look at Brassi and then Holyoke decision and then the Springfield decision as well.
Allie, you had a question?
Yes, I do. Just real quick. So we're hoping to do a lot of public input before we put together the RFP, so that hopefully our public input can be put and created into the RFP that before we put it out. And I'm a little concerned that we're going to talk a lot about design during the public input session, and also potentially the amount of affordability and things like that. Do you have any cautions about questions that we shouldn't answer, or I guess ways we can kind of sway the conversation to be more general and not very specific?
I just let them know what the law is. So you can't, anytime you're prescribing what the look has to be, you're crossing a line, or you're straddling a line anyway. And so I would not do, I just wouldn't have a perfect, this is the look that we want to see. Just reiterate that it has to be conceptual, it has to be, general, cannot be prescriptive. I think I say it 100 times, and folks never, the first thing they want to know is what's it going to look like. And that's even for trying to get the land surplus. I didn't say, which just reminded myself, that one thing that you don't want to do is send out an RFP, get it back, and then take that proposal to town meeting in order to get approval from town meeting. If developers know that they're going to have to go to sell it to town meeting, they're not going to do it, number one. Number two, then town meeting thinks they have the ability to change whatever has been proposed. So get it surplus first, do the RFP, don't have it go back to town meeting for any approvals once you do that.
Jay, you have a related follow-up?
Yeah, Laura, talk a little bit more about this, wanting to assert some desires around affordability, yet but not be too prescriptive. And I guess I've come to some comments, and then I'd love to hear your reaction. I mean, this is where I think the importance of having a really good housing needs assessment for your town is vital, because that's like the foundation, and it's not attached to any specific project, but it's basically articulating this is what our community needs, and if we're going to invest in this project, it needs to be responsive to the needs.
Right.
But then the other thing, in terms of trying to balance the community engagement, and people want to support a project because they know exactly who it's going to serve and what it's going to look like. I think maybe one of the ways to try to engage your community to talk about is, you know, we as a municipality are not development experts, and why we want to partner with the development, in addition to all the municipal procurement issues, is because we want to leverage a developer's creativity and experience to be responsive to our needs, but be able to do it in a way that we would never even have thought of, because that's not what we do.
Right. And that's how I talk to communities who want to get into specifics on design, and say, you know, I'm not a design professional, you know, and you know, there are people out there that have some fantastic ideas that we don't know about, that we wouldn't even think about, that until you see it on paper, you know, they're creative people, let them be creative. That's what they do. And you'd be surprised what, you know, what is proposed based on letting them, you know, let their minds go.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Maggie?
Hi, Laura. This goes to a question that was asked earlier. So I'm confused now. I thought from your answer that is the actual scorecard. My understanding is that the scorecard is the internal document to, you know, in our case, the trust, but the attachment, like the favorability criteria, that is part of the actual RFP. So I guess my question is when is the scorecard seen? And I mean, that's not put as an attachment to an RFP, is it?
Well, the evaluation criteria will have how it's scored. So in the sample that I had, all the criteria were on a level playing field. So, you know, 0 points for unacceptable, 3 points for advantageous, and 5 points, or, you know, whatever you want to, that's what Bourne put on that. And so that was explicit in the narrative, that how it was going to be scored, that everyone was scored, you know, every criteria was scored the same, weighted the same way. In Mashpee, it was different. There was a whole scoring, you know, different weights for each criteria. And, you know, most of the others have everything the same, but Mashpee was one that had different ones. And the one I was talking about with the developer, that one had different weights. But you have to be clear and transparent to the developer how it's going to be scored. You can't not tell them that something's going to be scored higher than something. One portion is going to be scored higher than another. So the actual scorecards are done at deliberation, and then become part of the public record.
Exactly. Okay. Because the evaluation criteria, and I understand that part about the scale and how they would be scored on a scale of whichever.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, it sort of answers my question. So the Mashpee one, the actual, because they had more specificity in their scorecard, that was something that was not part of the RFP. But in the narrative, it is stated, so it's not like you're not being transparent.
Right, right. They
Okay.
had, yeah, there was a whole scoring attachment.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we got a bunch of questions in the chat. So let's go.
Okay.
How
All right.
often, if at all, does the final design, income mix, et cetera, get changed after RFP approval once all the financing is obtained?
Once all the financing is obtained, it doesn't, because it has to meet that. Where it can change is in permitting. So it's supposed to be, consistent with the RFP, so they can't do, too much, but it often gets tweaked in permitting for, whatever reason, some site issues or things like that.
Okay, after an RFP is released, can any minor changes be made before the proposals come in?
Yes. If there's any changes, then there's a amendment to the RFP that's sent to everybody who has requested the RFP. It's important that you don't just send the RFP out to people that you want. You give them a link and they have to register to get the RFP, so that you have a list of everyone who has the RFP, so you can make sure everyone's up to date. That's the same with questions. If people have questions on the RFP, you have to answer it in writing and give it to everybody who has requested the RFP.
Okay. Can you talk more about how a town putting in funds could help a project? Is there a rule of thumb, ? 20 million project, town puts in 2 million, ?
It's all over the map how much towns contribute. It certainly is a factor in getting state funding. There's pretty much a requirement that there be some local funds or local support, or land or something that the town puts in, or the local community puts in, or the housing authority, whoever it may be. I've recently done a little chart of some recent projects and how much went in per unit, and it's all over the map. From the bigger the project, obviously the less per unit. I think that for 1 or 2 units, it's usually in the $65,000 per unit range. In the 40 units, it's more like 10 or 15,000 per unit. And it depends if the cost has been increased, like I said, based on a requirement for a wastewater treatment plant, or a requirement by the town that they have to do something extra, is costing extra, that may be for the betterment of the project and for the town, but sometimes they have to then pay for it.
Okay. Follow up to Allie's question. If we set up a community forum about what they would like to see in a project prior to any RFP being issued or developed, will that run afoul of public procurement laws?
No, unless what the result is a particular design that you then put in the RFP. Then it would be a problem.
I think we've got all the chat questions and all the hands resolved.
Yay.
Jay has a question.
Or a comment.
Laura, question and comment around town funds too.
Mm-hmm.
So Is it fair to say as well that town funds are key to create units above 60% of AMI, which means, so those are the units that won't be covered under the low income housing tax credit. And particularly when you get above 80% of AMI, there are not a lot of sources of subsidy for those units. And so is it fair to say that for a town that feels like it needs units above 60% of AMI, which is an important need on the Lower Cape?
Right. So
our town funds a really good way to kind of make it, going above the, say, $20,000-$30,000 per unit. Is that a good way to help a developer make those units possible?
yes, understand that there is workforce money that is $100,000 for between 60 and 120, I think it is, percent of AMI, which is typically enough to subsidize the above 80%.
But aren't there still problems with, that's the mass housing workforce funding stream. Aren't there still problems with that stream because our market rate rents on the Outer Cape are so low that they kind of, like I know at Village at Nauset Green, those 15 workforce housing units could only go up to 90% of AMI.
That's right. So then that's a policy question. Do you want to be subsidizing market rate housing?
And I would argue on the Outer Cape, we don't have a choice because we don't have market rate rental housing.
Right. It's about availability.
Because Airbnb and VRBO get rid of, eliminate it from the market.
I'm just stating it's a policy decision, and it's around availability, understanding that there still will be income limitations and rent limitations on those units, even if they are at market rate. They're now available, which there's limited available all over the Cape, not just, I know it's worse on the Lower Cape, but as someone who's just looking to find somebody a rental unit, it's almost impossible on the Mid Cape as well. So yes, so town funds is really important to do that. If the project's big enough to have tax credits, if the project is 20 units or less, then there's a funding source that allows 80% units to be subsidized, and most of our communities have maybe one project that's tax credit, and then the others would all be less than that, so less, the 20 units or less. So it's a jigsaw puzzle of need and availability of funds, and trying to layer the different requirements of the different funds, and then seeing, okay, how much more money do we need? Because this isn't gonna, fill the need. So then what can the town do, and what can the town do and put as fewer restrictions so we can go to the higher income if the lower income is being taken care of already.
Elaine, you had a question about how rents are set. Did Laura answer your question, or did you have more to that?
It's when we do have public forums, it's a question we get. And I understand it can be different for different projects based on funding source. I just want to know how to answer that question intelligently when people ask. Is it always the percentage of their income, but are there other factors that developers use to decide what rent is going to be charged?
So are you talking about specifically how much does a tenant get charged?
Yeah, I mean, this is off topic of the RFP, but when we do community engagement, it's a big question we get. Yeah.
So in most subsidized housing, unless it has what's called an operating subsidy, so like a Section 8 or an MRVP, rental assistance through, either HUD or the state, there is a set rent based on the target affordability limit. So the 50% rent would be the same for everyone who's in a unit that's designated as a 50% area median income limitation unit. Does that make sense? It's not determined by how much the tenant earns. It's a set amount based on how much a household at that income can afford. Does that make sense?
Sort of, yeah. Hard to explain to people, I think.
It's easier if you have the chart in front of you with the rents listed. So you can say at 50%, a one bedroom is $980, including utilities. And someone can earn up to one person can earn up to $46,000. I'm making these numbers up, but they're roughly there. Can make up to $46,000 in order to rent that apartment. So I always, when I'm explaining it to a group, I like to have the chart with me because that will, because it's different than what people think. It's different than what public housing is, where you only pay 30% of your income for rent.
Thank you.
That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, another thing I think it can be useful, Elaine, in a public engagement scenario, though, too, is that in addition to listing what that annual income limit is, it is breaking it down to what would the hourly wage be?
Yeah.
At 40 hours per week year round, because I think that is easier for people to understand. Like, oh, somebody who's earning $22 an hour can still earn $22 an hour and qualify for this low income housing tax credit unit. But then to also see, oh my gosh, if we have a couple and they're each making $22 an hour, that's a problem. Yeah.
Right.
Robert wanted to confirm those rent levels are HUD guidelines, right?
Yes, HUD guidelines.
And Maggie, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's typically the new rents come out in March, early April, so we're kind of keeping a watch as to see what happens with 2020 rents, incomes and rents from 2020.
Maggie had raised her hand.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you talked about this, but the lottery system, it seems to go along with this question in terms of, eligibility levels, and then how do you make choices in terms of, should all of this be in the RFP? I mean, as prescriptive again?
No.
Nothing about the lottery?
Nothing about the lottery. They have to do a lottery. They have to do marketing. It's not the town's responsibility to dictate that. It's not the developer is going to have to do it in order to get any affordable units to be on the SHI and to meet, whatever subsidy requirements. I will say that you should not put local preference in an RFP. It is not the developer's responsibility for local preference. If the town wants local preference, the town has to request it from the state. And local preference is only used in the lease up. After that, there's no local preference. So and the maximum at lease up is 70% of the units can be, of the affordable units can be local preference units maximum, and that's determined on need, and then balanced for minority participation. And once the lottery's over, or the first lease up is over, then the open pool, which has all the local preference folks in it as well, is the wait list. And so after that first lease up, there is no more local preference. It's a question I get all the time, so I thought and a lot of people try and put it in their RFP, but it is not the responsibility of the developer, so there's no reason to ask the developer for it.
Allie?
Sorry, just going on your local preference discussion. So would the town ask for local preference during the 40B process, or at what point does the town ask?
So the town has to ask and provide documentation to the subsidizing agency if it's a 40B, or to DHCD if it's not a 40B. They have to provide documentation and an ask within 3 months of the 40B permit being final.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the last question. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I have one kind of announcement from MHP, and that on March 18th, which is a little less than 2 weeks, on a Thursday, from 12 to 1:15, I'm going to be hosting a listening session for the Cape and Islands around housing issues. It will be MHP's community assistance team is looking for input on the regional housing needs, who's not being served, who needs to be part of the conversation, and if you know folks who should be part of the conversation, and it doesn't have to be housing folks, it could be racial or income equality folks, to join us. We're team's going to be there listening to what your needs are, how MHP can do better, and what needs you might have that we're not serving now. So I will get an announcement. It's on our webpage, mhp.net, under events. You can register. I'd love to have as many people there as possible. Again, we're not going to have a formal presentation. We'll have some questions that we'll ask, but it's really a dialogue and a listening session. We want to hear from you. So.
And Laura, you mentioned that you're looking for participation from the unusual suspects, right? Including housing advocates and people who are representing other groups. You want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, we're, like a lot of agencies, we're starting to look at our work through a more equitable lens. And in doing that, we know that there are segments of the population who aren't heard and haven't been heard in the past. And we want to bring those folks into the conversation. And so this is part of how we can better serve all populations on the Cape. And so that's what we're looking for. That's who we want to hear from everyone, but we're especially reaching out to the folks that are not our usual suspects.
And we'll include that information in the follow-up materials so that you can all spread the invitation into your networks. Unless you have anything else you want to share, Laura?
No.
I just want to remind folks that we have an action-packed middle of April. Our spring outer and lower Cape peer group meetings are going to take place on April 13th and 15th. virtually, of course. And then on the 16th, we have Shelley, who I believe is on the call still, also from MHP, talking to us about trust and the Community Preservation Act. And we've been working together to tailor this training, which she's offered before, to be more relevant to the Lower Cape, and a really interesting conversation, I think, to be had about boards working together. So Laura, thank you so much for talking to us about RFPs. I know this is a topic that's really relevant to a lot of our communities right now, so I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for being here. Always great to talk to my neighbors.
We'll be including your contact information in the follow-up material, so if anyone has any other pressing questions that come up, you can get in touch with Laura or us, and we'll pass it along. I hope you all have a great rest of your Friday, and thank you for being here with us. Bye, everybody.
Bye.